Okay, we were talking about food. Yesterday we spoke a little bit about bread, the concept of bread being a staple. It's got a different kind of a blessing attached to it. The idea of perhaps taking bread eating a little bit more seriously than other foods that get eaten. I'd like to take off a moment, even though it's not. I mean, it's obviously it's bread related, and I'd just like to talk a little bit about Birkat Hamazon. When we what's called benching in the vernacular, right? Birkat Hamazon, however you want to call it, grace after meals, right? Whatever your whatever your flavor is, please feel free to call it that. But I don't know if you've ever actually looked at what it is that you're saying. Now, I realize that's a reasonably radical concept, to actually investigate what it is that you're saying. It's normally enough that we're saying it, right? Why should I need to know what it is? But it's not a bad idea, it really isn't. If you take a look at Birkat, if I were to ask you, let's start at the beginning. If I were to ask you, Birkat Hamazon, what is the function of benching? What would you say?
Thanking God for the food.
Thanking God for the food you just eaten. If you read through Birkat Hamazon, you'll see that the first paragraph takes care of thanking God. And then the rest of it has got absolutely nothing to do with what you just did.
Talk about Yerushalayim and everything else.
Yeah, more than that, right? We talk about, the second paragraph talks about the land of Israel. It talks about Bris Milah, about circumcision. Then we start talking about the rebuilding of Jerusalem. We start talking about the Davidic dynasty.
What's all that with food?
For goodness sakes, everything is to do with food in Judaism. But all you did was had a lousy sandwich, right? Now all of a sudden you're sitting over there. There are many people over here, I'm sure not here in this room, because everybody over here, if you're going to eat, then obviously the idea of being able to recite Birkat Hamazon is something which appeals to you. It's something which you find to be very uplifting and inspiring, I'm sure. And the idea of sitting down for 20 minutes and struggling your way through the Hebrew is obviously that's a challenge that you embrace wholeheartedly. For most Jews, by the time you've finished Birkat Hamazon, then you're hungry again, and you've got to wash your hands and start all over again. It's kind of one of these eternal cycles. But I don't know. There are people who there are people who don't eat bread because they don't want to bench afterwards. They don't want to recite Birkat Hamazon. Why? Because it's a little bit longer. Somebody who's fluent in Hebrew, so Birkat Hamazon probably takes, the enormous amount of maybe 4 minutes. It's like we're busy people, right? So who's got 4 minutes to spare? Of course, you just spent half an hour gorging yourself, but 4 minutes at the end is something which obviously needs to be measured. Each second is precious, right? What's the idea? It seems ridiculous. All you did was have a sandwich, you sat down, you had a meal, right? If the whole function of Birkat Hamazon, where did the sandwich come from? It really depends. I mean, you can get around the corner, they have up in
that's why you do benching, surely. And one of the ideas of doing benching
is
to thank the person.
Yeah, for sure. But here, that you do that with the first paragraph.
Okay.
The first paragraph takes care of all of the thanks, which means that you thank, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu Hazanes Ha'olam, that he gives sustenance to the whole world, right? Hu noisen lechem l'chol basar v'dam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us our food, which means if the whole function of benching is simply to be able to say thank you, then we would say just the first blessing and we'd be done.
Why do you need 3 people?
Oh, hold on, we'll come to that after. That's a Gemara and Brachos have got a separate dimension. Just the idea, just right now, the idea of benching, right? So what are we doing over here? I mean, really, it sounds quite bizarre. You had something to eat, and now you said thank you, and after you said thank you, you talk about the land of Israel, and then you talk about Bris Milah, and then you talk about the Davidic dynasty, and then you talk about the land, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and for goodness sakes. Right? It should let it have some kind of a connection with what you've just done. I don't know, pass around recipes to each other, but what's one thing got to do with the other? So, the answer is something which, of course, is very Jewish. Strangely enough, right? Obviously, but if we eat in order to work and we work in order to eat, which is definitely a dimension of certain people's lives for sure, then you only need the first paragraph of benching of Birkat Hamazon to fulfill your obligation. Right? If the whole function of what you're doing is that you're hungry, so you need food now in order to be able to continue doing what you've just been doing or to do something new, and then later on you'll get hungry again, so you'll eat again in order to be able to continue living your life, then the first paragraph will take care of everything. You can say to God, thank you very much for what you gave me. If Birkat Hamazon is simply a case of saying thank you, then that's all you need to do, right?
But it's also a stage of bring us back to the way that we could bless you before.
So here, let's have a look. Let's have a look and see. Right, there's a dimension. There's a dimension to eating. Believe it or not, there's a dimension to eating which is beyond just physical sustenance. Right, and what is that? It's the idea that the stronger I am, the healthier I am, the easier it is for me to be able to build up my relationship with God. I'll give you a very basic example. I think with the exception perhaps of Yom Kippur, right? On Yom Kippur everyone's very busy in shul, there's a lot to do in Yom Kippur. But most other fast days, by the time you get to the afternoon, you could get a little bit grouchy, you get a little bit snappy, you're not functioning properly because you're tired and you're hungry and you're thirsty. And it's not easy to fast. When we eat, we are able to utilize the koyach, the power that's been given to us through the food that we've eaten. We can utilize it for the spiritual realms as well. I don't mean obviously spiritual. I don't mean that now that you've eaten you're going to pray better, or now that you've eaten you're going to learn better, or now that you've eaten you're going to fulfill your mitzvahs better. I'm talking about just in general, right? Hold on a second. When a person eats, so after you've eaten, you interrelate better with other people. You may be a little bit more, a little gentler, a little bit more thoughtful, because you're not, you don't have those hunger pangs there anymore, which means that you become a slightly easier person to be around. If that's the case, what we're learning over here is something something very beautiful, actually, which means the function of eating is not just in order for us to continue living. The function of eating is to turn us into better people than we were before, which is going to be translated obviously into mitzvah observance, the way that we perform our mitzvahs. Right? So again, if I'm eating in order to become a slightly better person than I was, so now I need to define what being a better person is going to bring about, right? If I perform my mitzvahs a little bit better, if I'm nicer to other people, if I'm kinder to other people, if I'm gentler to other people because I'm no longer hungry, what is going to be the repercussion of what I've just done? That's what benching spells out. The second part of benching, after you said thank you, spells out that if I do what I'm supposed to do, then we're going to bring about, there's going to be some kind of a spiritual movement that's going to allow the building of the temple and the Davidic dynasty to come that little bit closer than it was before.
Then why do we only say it for certain things? Why do we say it then, Allah, whatever, Allah mechia for certain things?
So here, like we spoke about yesterday, the bread symbolizes something different from all the other kinds of foods.
So let's say I've had pasta, where I've had an actual meal. I still don't say Allah mechia for having that. I still only would say Allah mechia.
We'll talk about it, okay. Right? But the idea over here is simply that the idea of sitting down and having a meal, again, I think we've got to try. It's a little bit complicated, but we have to make a differentiation between a meal and a meal, right? A meal halachically is sitting down. According to Jewish law, that's sitting down and eating bread. And when you sit down and eat bread, now you've got to understand, why did I just do that? What was the function of what I just did? The function of what I just did was to be able to, believe it or not, with every mouthful of food that you eat, you're building the temple. It's going to bring the building of the temple that little bit closer. Right? Maybe that explains why Jews tend to be overweight. I mean, it's nothing to do with food. It's to do with the spiritual dimensions, for sure, right? Mm-hmm. Right, yeah?
Yeah.
For sure. Good. Right. They tell over a cute little story about some chassid who came to his Rebbe. And he's telling over all his, speaking to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says, "Excuse me for a minute." He takes an apple and makes a blessing. And the chassid, thinking to himself, he says, wow. He says, "I don't know, he eats, I eat. I mean, what's the difference between us? Why am I here?" He didn't say a word. And the Rebbe looks at the chassid and he says, "You want me to tell you what the difference is between us?" So the fellow thinks, "Oh, okay." He says, "Yeah." So the Rebbe says, "You make blessings in order to eat. I eat in order to make blessings." Now, the end result is the same, right? The end result is that an apple's going to get eaten somehow, or that meal is going to be eaten. But the difference is, where are you placing your emphasis? Am I placing my emphasis on the more physical dimensions, which means that I'm just going to make the blessing in order to be able to eat what it is that I have to eat? Or am I eating in order to be able to bring those blessings into being? It's a very beautiful idea, it really is. I mean, it's like, like a a balance over here between doing what we need to do, and doing it in a way that's going to enhance our spiritual identity. Right? So when we bench, we're not just saying thank you. There's more to eating than just eating. And that's going to spell out the spiritual dimensions. And that means that when I come to eat, I'm going to bench afterwards. I'm going to recite Birkat HaMazon, because over there it's telling me what the function is of what I've just done. Right? In order to be a better person, in order to fulfill the mitzvahs better, in order to bring about the Mashiach, the Messiah. Maybe next.
What does a bris milah got to do?
Because the bris milah is the symbol of the fact of why we're still around. There is no reason why the Jewish people should still be here. No, there's no logical reason, no rational reason. Anybody here, you don't need to be a big expert in history to realize that the Jewish people are the most persecuted nation throughout history. Not just in one particular time. Throughout history. And the only reason we're still here is because we have a bris milah, because we belong to God. And that bris milah, that circumcision, is part of your identity, which means now that you know who you are, now that you know that you're affiliated to God, now you can do what you're supposed to do. You can make it in a way that's supposed to reflect that.
It's for the land, right?
Yes, yeah. Right? The connection of the Jewish people with the land. It's interesting that the first thing after the first blessing, when we say thank you, and then we say Noida L'cha Hashem Elokeinu, and we talk about the land of Israel, and we talk about bris milah, because those are the things which define our unique relationship with God. And that's part of what eating is all about. Yeah.
Is it a sin to overindulge in eating, and if so, is there a definition of when?
I mean, look,
when you've reached that point?
you're asking that question to somebody who could definitely do with losing 30 pounds, right?
Yeah.
So obviously,
You look fine, Rabbi.
hey, my friend. Wow. If you could come home with me, please. Just tell my wife that. I would very much appreciate it.
We'll sit in the back of the class.
Wait, no, it's corn video, so it's fine. You can just reflect.
It's interesting. You should know, interestingly enough, that it's a good question. The Gemara, the Torah talks about the very famous Ramban, Nachmanides, one of the classic commentaries on the Chumash. Nachmanides says that you shouldn't be a naval bereshut haTorah, which means that you shouldn't overindulge in things that you're allowed to have simply because you're allowed to have them. Which means don't become. I don't know how to describe it, but don't become degenerate.
You're going back to the point you said yesterday about control.
Yeah, right. But don't become degenerate within things that you're allowed to do. Right, because again. Are you doing something wrong? It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that you can't eat too much chocolate cake. It doesn't say that, right? It doesn't say here you can eat this amount and not more, and if you eat more than that, then you're transgressing and you're going to go to Gehenna, right?
Maimonides bring that up?
Huh?
The Rambam?
The Rambam talks about the way that a person's supposed to eat. The Rambam's got, there's something called the Rambam diet, right? And the idea of leaving a certain amount of food on your plate, and the idea of control, and the idea of not allowing yourself to succumb. The Ramban, Nachmanides, is talking about something a little bit more extreme than that. The Ramban is saying that something which is allowed for you to do, that doesn't mean that you can abuse what it is that you're allowed to have. So, again, it's difficult. There's no measure over here. Part of the problem why there are no measurements over here is because everybody's different, right? Which means that you can have somebody they can stuff themselves silly every day, right, full of unhealthy food, and they remain skinny, and they don't have cholesterol problems, and they don't have blood pressure problems. And then you can have people like me. I used to have a friend like that. He was he still is, skinny as can be. I know this is kind of difficult to believe that I had a friend, right? But I am not going to tell you his name, so this cannot be verified. You just have to take it at face value. But he would sit down and he would eat a loaf of bread, and I would watch him and get fat. Go figure, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God has a sense of humor, right? That's for sure. How does it? I think that's part of the problem. Like, at what point? What is okay? What's not okay, right?
Was Nachmani just talking about food when he said
No,
that?
no. He was talking about a lifestyle, actually, in general.
So including Torah study. That's allowed, right?
You know what? Good. Okay, that's a. All right. I didn't realize that's where you were going. If I would have realized that you were setting me up like that, then I wouldn't have answered the way that I did, would I? Huh?
What's this?
Did you take care of him afterwards? You know, yeah. Hold on a second. Yesterday we spoke about somebody called Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Yesterday, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was the greatest halachic authority of the generation. He died about 30 years ago, and you know, his wife told over she described Rav Moshe Feinstein as being like a drunkard, right? But instead of being drunk on wine, he was drunk on Torah. And she said, it's like, I can't drag him away from learning. She's like, I just can't do it. You know, it doesn't work. Is it possible to overdose on Torah? So I'll tell you something very interesting. I don't want this to be taken out of context, which of course means it will be. But yes, I think it is possible to overdose on Torah. I think it is possible to overdose on spirituality. Certainly for people on our kinds of level, where we're not, you know, maybe we're not quite as balanced as we would like to think that we are. It's possible to take on too much, and to you know, to be sort of to have our mental and our spiritual equilibrium, you know, sort of like pushed out of place a little bit.
You could be indulging in terror a lot more than ever, but you're neglecting responsibilities to your wife and your children.
Oh, that's okay. Anyone with a wife or children will understand that. That's what makes Torah so attractive, for sure. You know, it's interesting. My mother-in-law has always said that if you take a look at the way that we pray 3 times a day, right? And she always says that they're in very, very strategic moments of the day, right? So in the morning when you're supposed to be helping with the kids and getting them up, getting them out to school, it's like, hey, I'd love to help, but I got to go daven. What can I do? You know? And then in the afternoon, when you got to go pick up the kids from school and bring them back, say, hey, you know, I'd love to do it, but I got to go daven. and of course, in the evening time, when you're supposed to be bathing the kids and putting this bed, you know, it's like, you know, I'd love to, but I have to go daven. That's the one thing that the Arabs have better than us. They daven 5 times a day. That's probably because they have more than one wife, so they've got to make sure that they're out the house the whole time. Can you overdose on Torah? You can. I think when you get to a certain level where you've got the most incredible spiritual balance inside of your life, then at that point I don't think you can anymore, right? But I do think that on the way up, until you reach that level, I think it is possible that a person could you know, push themselves out of whack a little bit and do themselves some damage, right? I think in spiritual terms, you know, doing things slowly but surely is a much better recipe for success than sort of like embracing everything. I always tell over, you know, here in Osamer that there are what are called FFBs and BTs, right? A BT is a Baal Teshuvah, and an FFB is a from birth, right? And here in Osamer we have FFTs, right? What's an FFT? From Tuesday. You know, he came in on Sunday and that's it. By Tuesday he's completely orthodox and taken upon everything, and it doesn't normally last. It doesn't work. And maybe that's, you know, there's a saying in the Gemara, there's a saying, tafasta meruba loy tafasta, that I guess in our lexicon, we would say you've bitten off more than you can chew. Tafasta meruba loy tafasta, you grabbed a hold of so much to the end, you're left with nothing. Everything slips through your fingers in the end, right? And the idea of building up slowly and building up healthily is something which is far better in spiritual terms than trying to grab a hold of everything in the hope that something's going to stick around at the end. Yeah.
That'd be a bit horrible.
I mean, that would definitely be an improvement for you.
Thank you. What relationship does grace after meals, bread, and everything that have to do with the concept of the topic of kashrus?
What?
Of kashrut. Oh, because here, I mean, kashrut, again, kashrut is not just what you eat.
Is that an offensive question?
No, not at all. Oh, you got to do better than that if you want to be offensive. Come on.
Can I get any teaching? I'm joking.
kashrut is, it's interesting, right? Right here, we could make the mistake of imagining that kashrut is simply talking about the food that you eat. What food is kosher, what food is not kosher. Kashrut is something which is far, far greater than that. It's something which encompasses an awful lot more than just food, actually. Person has to lead a kosher lifestyle. What is a kosher lifestyle? Not just the food that you eat, right? The way that you interact, everything, right? Within the food that we eat, kosher is not just whether you can have this piece of meat or that piece of meat, or you can have this or you can have that. It's also to do with how do I eat this? Once I've got this thing on my plate, what do I do now? Right? And the idea of making brachot and the idea of what brachos we make at the beginning and how we make the brachos at the end are very much an integral part of what being kosher really means.
Yeah.
Right? Which means that it's really, I think Birkat Hamazon is sort of like the poster boy for explaining to us what kashrut really means. That the impact of what we're doing, it's not just the moment that we're eating it, but the impact that it's going to have afterwards is something which is going to be defined by the bracha that I make at the beginning and the bracha that I make at the end.
What does it mean then? If you're saying it in that sense, what does it mean if I'm asked about kosher clothing? If someone says this person is kosher, or this person is kosher, what does that mean?
Kosher clothing is clothing which is going to fulfill fulfill all the various laws of being tznius, of being modest.
What is
What is tznius? Modesty, right? So the emphasis is like this: for women, the laws of clothing are more complicated than they are for men. For men, they're normally, it's really not that complicated. You should wear something, not something that's always done, but wear something. For women, there are various parts of the body that have to remain covered. It's a little bit more complicated. Kashrus of clothing, we spoke yesterday about the concept of shatnez, of not wearing wool and linen together. That's also a dimension of wearing kosher clothing. What else? I can't think of what else.
Where did the strummel come in?
Oh my gosh.
No, I'm saying,
Where does it come in? If you go up the road on Shabbos, right? You ever go up the road on Shabbos, you'll see that the Hasidim are wearing either what's called a shtreimel or a spodek. They're furry hats. Of course, in the middle of the summer, it's like, take a moment to just look at that again because it's warm outside and they're wearing these things on top of their heads that are pretty heavy and they're pretty hot. Where do they come from? They come from Eastern Europe. There were all kinds of laws that were proclamated against the Jews. They were instructed that they had to wear hats, the kind of hats that were worn by the people over there in Eastern Europe, in Poland and in Russia. So that's where the idea of a spodek is tall and thin, like me, right? Thank you. And the shtreimel is short and fat, not like me, right? Mm-hmm. I got that right, yeah? Mm-hmm. Good, okay. Where do they come from, the difference between the two? So it depends on which chassidut you're affiliated to, depends on what kind of hat you're going to wear. And it's to do with being based in Poland or being based in Russia. What they did was they switched with each other, and the ones in Poland wore the Russian-style hat, and the ones in Russia wore the Polish-style hat in order to fulfill the decree that had been decreed against them, but to do it in such a way that they would still be able to have a distinctive mode of dress that was going to leave them with their Jewish identity. There's a beautiful little story they tell about a maskil, an enlightened Jew, who came across a Hasidic Rebbe in his Shabbos regalia in the middle of the summer in Eastern Europe. It was pretty hot, and he comes over to him and says to him, he says, "Rabbi," he says, "tell me," he says, "Avram Avinu, what did he wear? Did he wear a spodek or did he wear a shtreimel? Right? Did he wear a tall furry hat or a short furry hat?" And the Rebbe looked at him, he says to him, "I don't know," he says, "but I'm sure that he wore something which made him look different from everybody else." And that's really why they dress the way that they dress in order to look different from everybody else. And when you go up the streets, dressed in your shorts and t-shirts, and people ask you why you dress like that, you can say, because you want to look different from everybody else. That's right. In Sharm, you're going to look different, right?
What's kind of to do with clothing then?
Huh?
It's kind of to do with clothing. Why do women, after they're married, wear shaitels?
there's again, this is, for somebody who asked, well, I mean, everybody here in this room knows that Birchas Hamazon is somehow, connected to food, right? And why? And but for the person who asked the question to start asking questions like that, that's called chutzpah, Jewish chutzpah. That's okay. It's a question. Women, when they get married, they cover their hair. Why do they cover their hair? So it's based on a pasuk that talks about in Parshas Nosei the Sota that got taken out and they uncovered their hair in the temple. The Gemara learns from there that a married woman, it's a dioraisa, it's a Torah law that a married woman should have her hair covered. The question over here is, why do women wear shaitels? Very often the wig is nicer than the hair here, like your toupee that you used to have, right?
Supper abolished that.
Yeah. There are different Hasidus, but the idea is...
We bring it up about kosher clothing.
Yeah. So here, they're different, again, sometimes you'll find women wearing it's called a shaitel, which is a Yiddish for the word for a wig, right? It's a covering, it's a wig that looks nicer than their hair does. And why is that allowed? So first of all, just to dispel a misconception, there's nothing wrong with having nice hair. Your hair, the problem over here is that a married woman should not expose her hair to anyone but her husband. It's considered to be something which is private to the relationship that exists between a husband and a wife, and it's not something which is open to other people. Covering your hair, so it's true that there are certain authorities, halakhic authorities, who are against the idea of wearing shaitels. There are certainly some who are against the idea of wearing very expensive, very glamorous shaitels. However, there are plenty of halakhic authorities who say that it's okay. I once asked my Rabbi in London, many, many years ago, the same question, and he told me something quite interesting, actually. I was expecting him to go on some kind of a tirade against expensive shaitels, and it's ridiculous, and that it shouldn't be allowed, and let's go and burn them, even if they're still wearing them, we should burn them straight away, and he told me something, he said quite the opposite. He says, as men, we have no idea how difficult it is to keep your head covered. We just don't know it, right? To keep your head. So it's one thing to wear a yarmulke, it's one thing to wear a kippah, but to have to keep your hair covered the whole time, he says, we have no idea how difficult it is. He says, and anything that's going to allow women to be able to fulfill the mitzvah is something that it's not for us to critique. Right? Which means that if some people can afford to have very expensive shaitels that look very glamorous, and that's the way that they're going to be able to cover their hair, then he's saying that's what they should do, because that's fulfilling the mitzvah of making sure that her hair is not exposed. Yeah.
So why not go further and say any part on the body should not be exposed, like how Muslims...
Yeah, good, okay. Because I always say this, nobody ever believes me, certainly not here in Osamer, but Judaism is the most realistic religion in the world. It really is. Which is that, Judaism is teaching that certain parts of the body are obviously parts of the body that should be covered because they are, we're being recorded, right? So I'm trying to use a word, they are evocative, right? Will that do? Is that...
Sure.
They have a certain eroticism to them that it doesn't require very much imagination to work out why they need to be covered. The other parts of the body don't have that connotation, and therefore you don't have to keep them covered. Back to food, right? So bread, that's one food stuff. Now, other food stuffs are going to be broken down into what's inside of them. Depending on what's inside, depends on what kind of blessing you're going to make over them. So we're moving down. The next bracha down after we've made hamotzi is the bracha of mizonot. Right? What's called mizonos in Ashkenazi pronunciation, mizonot. What is mizonot? Mizonot is food that's got a significant amount of flour inside of it, but it's not bread. So any food stuff that anything you want to come up with, pasta, cake, biscuits, pretzels, couscous, rice. So we'll talk about rice at the end because rice is a little bit complicated. Even though rice doesn't have any flour in it, but it's got a mazonas nevertheless. But we'll talk about it. Yeah.
How about schnitzel?
Schnitzel, interesting, right? So at one point there were authorities that felt that maybe you needed to make 2 brachot over schnitzel, right? The first bracha being on the coating, which would be a mizonot. And then to make a shahakol on the chicken inside. However, there's a very important concept inside of the bracha, inside the halacha of food, which is to do with something called ikar and tefel. The ikar is the essence of what you're eating, the important part of what you're eating, and the tefel is the less important part of what you're eating. So, for example, in schnitzel, the most important part, halachically, what's looked upon as being the important part is the chicken inside.
No, but I eat it because it tastes good.
Well, that's okay. We all eat it because it tastes. Actually, that's not true. We're Jewish. We eat it because it's there.
I wouldn't eat grilled chicken. I would eat schnitzel because it's breaded.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I'm the same.
Really?
Yeah.
Otherwise,
That's
I would probably
interesting.
eat grilled chicken. It's healthy.
But you never buy the coat only.
What?
Yeah, which means you don't eat
coat.
only the coating,
No, of course not.
right? Which means that here again,
You don't
once again,
you only eat the cake that has the
no. So here we're talking about ratios over
has
here.
value.
Yeah, right. Which means like this: if you I don't know, if you're going to eat a schnitzel that's got a coating this thick, right? Then maybe you would need to make two different blessings over it. If you were here, I'll give you an example. Let's move away from schnitzel for a minute because I think schnitzel's a little bit more complicated. But cheesecake, oh, I got some reactions. Look at that. If I would have realized, I would have said cheesecake ages ago.
Would that be shakur? Or?
Here, so it's interesting. Cheesecake comes with a base and a filling. So it's a big halachic question over here. What bracha do you make over cheesecake? Do you make mazonos over the cheesecake because of the base? Or do you make shahakol because of the filling? Now, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, one of the great halachic authorities from the previous generation, he ruled like this. He says, if the only function of the base is to keep the filling inside, then you should make a shahakol on the filling and not on you shouldn't make a bracha over the base. Right now, I think that the definition of that is going to be perhaps thickness. If you've got a very thin base over there, which is clearly only there just to keep everything in place, then you're not eating that because of the base, you're eating it because of the filling. If you've got a base which is slightly thicker than that, then part of your enjoyment is not just the filling, but it's the base as well. And if that's the case, then you should be making a mazonos over the whole cake and not making two brachas, though. You don't make two. I'll tell you one of the few times that I can think of off the top of my head where you would make two different brachas. They have some concoction over here in Israel called a krembo. A krembo is, again, you either love these things or you hate them, but they are marshmallow that are covered in chocolate in the shape of a ball with a flat bottom, and they've got a biscuit at the bottom. Now you have two completely separate foodstuffs over here.
Yeah.
You've got the marshmallow part, and you've got the biscuit, and the biscuit is whole and absolutely identifiable. And the poskim say, the authorities say that for that you should make two different brachas. You should make a bracha of mazonos over the biscuit, and then you should make a bracha of shahakol over the krembo itself, because they're individual entities. Here, I'll give you another example. Oh, I just thought of it now. It's pretty similar though. Ice cream in a cone. That was an och, or that was an och? Ah.
Amazing.
I couldn't work out if it was an och or an och.
What about cheesecake ice cream?
You could, right? What about schnitzel ice cream? Right here, now we can really get going over here, right? But you hear what's the problem? It's very simple. It's like visually, it's very simple to work out what the problem is. You have an ice cream, right? You have the ice cream is separate from the cone. The cone is its own entity, and the ice cream is something which sits inside of the cone. Right, at that point, you would need to make two different brachas over what it is that you're eating. You'd have to make a mazonos over the cone, and you would have to make a shahakol over the ice cream, because they're not combined with each other.
So,
The schnitzel, maybe what's going to make the differentiation, I'm just thinking out loud, but maybe what's going to make the differentiation over here is the fact they're combined with each other, right? Which means if you have got some kind of, sort of like, I don't know, some kind of genetic, disabled gene inside of you that makes you scrape off the cover of your schnitzel and eat the two separately, then you would probably have to make two different brachas over them. But as long as they're combined with each other, you should make a shahakol, because you, like you mentioned, you're not going to eat the coating without the inside, and the inside is what becomes the ikar, the important part, and the coating becomes the tefel, that becomes the less important part, the secondary part. That's okay, it's fine.
So that's the more important part to me.
No, I don't think that's true. Because if that was true, then you would eat the outer part without the schnitzel altogether.
Sometimes after I finish my schnitzel, there's the outer part, and I still want to eat it. I don't know.
Wait a minute, how do you finish your schnitzel if the outer part is not?
Sometimes there's like a crumb.
Yeah.
It's delicious.
Okay,
It's
good.
and it's,
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay, I would say like this: if there's enough left over, then you would probably need to make a mazonos over it.
okay.
I've got kids. I hesitate to say this because it really is quite. And the more I think about it, it's really quite revolting actually. But I've got kids who, when they make schnitzels, so at the end with the leftover gunk, they make little balls of of fried non-schnitzel. I don't know what you want to call it. I don't know. And for that, for sure, you have to make a mazonos over it. You're going to eat a little bally like that, or whatever shape it is. It doesn't have to be a ball. It can be any shape. Yes. No.
So you
Well,
say,
I do.
so we say the bracha on what has value in it.
Yeah.
So if I eat like a brownie that has a certain type of like a fruit or something in it,
Oh, okay. So here, it's not fair what you're doing, because you're bringing up examples which are not easy examples to deal with.
Right.
If you're eating a brownie, a raisin brownie, if you're eating a raisin brownie and the raisins are whole and identifiable, then you would probably need to make two different brachas. One bracha over the brownie itself and one bracha over the raisin, which would be bari priya eitz, right? If you're eating a brownie that's got fruit in it, but it's not identical, it's been cut up very small, or it's been ground up and mixed all together, then at that point you're just going to make a bracha over the brownie itself, right? Sometimes you have certain kinds of cakes that have whole bits of whole fruit inside of them, and then it would be fruit cakes, or certain kinds of flans and tarts and things like that, right? You do have to be careful. Things that have got identifiable bits of food in them become a little bit of a problem. I'll give you another example, maybe, which can be used over here in the dining room, which is that when you get soup, now normally the bracha that's made over soup is shahakol, right? But if you add soup almonds in, mandalach, right, into your soup, then you need to make a mazonos over the mandalach, and you need to make a shahakol over the soup, because they're two separate.
Israeli, right? In Israel, that isn't the case. In Israel, they boil them first, I think it is. Are you talking about?
They bake the mandalach, right? Normally they bake them in order that there shouldn't be a problem over there with whatever. I mean, it's a suffix on the brachas, but you need to make a mazonos over them. Rabbi Geffen is either has some kind of a nervous twitch, or he's trying to indicate that we only have another 20 minutes left. Is that what you were trying to say?
I'm out.
Rabbi Geffen, the guys, they thoroughly enjoy learning about food, and they were just wondering about the possibility of having some kind of a practical
demonstration.
Quick, before he comes back, I once had a boy who came to me, I'm not kidding, he came to me with his lunch plate, and he says to me, "What
The
blessing?"
bracha on this would be not for you, it's not on your diet.
Oh, what?
It's okay, he's been confirmed as skinny.
Does anybody know what bracha you make over cake?
Shahakol.
Mazonos, right? It's got lots of flour in here. So if anybody wants to make a bracha, you should make a bracha, make a mazonos. So somebody once came to me from the lunchroom with his plate, and he says to me, "What blessing do you make over something green and unidentifiable?" That's a question for the dining room over here, right? I told him you should say shahakol. Shahakol niyeh beseder. After you eat it, everything should be okay. Okay, we're going to stop over here. Mitzvah Hashem. Tomorrow, maybe tomorrow we'll talk about steak, and maybe that way we can get Rabbi Geffen to make a barbecue. Today we spoke about mazonos, so look, we got a piece of cake. That's not bad.